Hi, everybody. Your friends from the Astro Imaging channel have been having a wonderful discussion about so many things getting ready for tonight's show. And we do have some things to tell you about. So let me go start in my screen share here, and I'll tell you about them. Um, One is on the calendar. Tonight, you can see we've got Bryan Gibson. He's going to tell us about the amazing histogram. It may be smarter than you think. And the guys were discussing it, and they said, yeah, Alex, it is probably smarter than you. And then John's going to be here next week. John's going to be, he was rescheduled from earlier. And I've seen John talk about he's in love with his new CMOS camera. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. John, you out there? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, I'm here. Sure. So the presentation is called Leveraging New Generation CMOS Technology, but in reality, it applies just as much to the new cameras that are out there as it does to CCDs and stuff. And really, it's about how to optimize what you do when you image. How do you pick the exposure time? Stuff like that. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit about maybe what a few of my friends think is coming up in the future too when it comes to these high-tech cameras. So yeah, look forward to it.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Um, and then I wanted to point out to everybody to be sure that over the next couple of weeks, then we will be celebrating the holidays. Merry Christmas to everybody. We aren't going to have a program, and the same thing on January 1st for Happy New Year. So we won't be there. And then we'll be coming back with another bunch of people coming in to talk to us about various things. You'll notice, however, on Sunday, February 19th, we've got a blank. And then starting in March, we have a blank for quite a while. We need you guys to hit the contact button so that you can tell us who you are and tell us your email, tell us a little bit about what you want to talk about. And we've been doing pretty well lately. People have been contacting us and scheduling themselves through this system. So please do that, and we'll continue having good presentations for you every week. The hardest part of this job is making sure we've got people to talk to you every week. Now, there's one other thing I want to tell you about. Earlier, we had scheduled a TAIC workshop for December, but we were not getting the responses. We weren't getting enough people. Well, we decided that what we could do is kind of give you more time to work on Terry's wonderful data. He sent us in a bunch of NGC 55s, and you can go get the data by clicking on the file, the zip. You get the zip file here in that one, and then after you've worked on it, you submit it, and then after you submit it, Rory will look through it, and he'll contact you, and he'll tell you about it, and you may be asked to help present it on February 26th, I think it says. So you've got until February 12th to get your effort in. It's always amazing to us how a given set of data turns into all these different pictures. They're all excellent pictures, and they're all done ever so slightly, grabbing one part of the data set or another part of the data set. And it's fun to watch how the various volunteers have worked through the various problems that the data present. One of the things, of course, that they have to do is we have here on the YouTube here, there's a place for you to check in and say hey to everybody, because these are your Astro Imaging channel buddies. You'll notice that we're up to 14.1 thousand subscribers now, and there are about 52 of you out there right now. So hi, everybody. You'll notice that on your screen, at least, if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a place to subscribe. We would like you to subscribe if you can, because it helps us to reach out to you and so forth. And of course, ask your questions over here. As Bryan today goes through his story of the amazing histogram, or the strong, yeah, maybe smarter than you think. That's what the title is. As Bryan goes through that, you're going to have some questions. So ask them over here. We'll probably wait towards the end before we go ahead and put them up for consumption. But at any rate, that's what's happening today. And to make sure that we know what's going to happen, let's bring Bryan on. And Bryan, tell us about, start your screen share and tell us about the mighty histogram.
All right. I'll go to present now. Okay, you see my screen.
We are seeing your screen and it looks like it's in presentation mode, so go ahead.
All right, good. Um, my name is Bryan Gibson. I'm very glad to be here. This evening I would like to tell you about actually it's a friend of mine. It became a friend of mine. It may sound kind of unusual, but I actually refer to him by a first name, Histo. It was actually created a couple of years ago to help my granddaughter, which at the time was just 4 years old, to learn how to understand and use a DSLR. And at 8 now, she can image the sky. Anyway, this histogram, is a good friend. He's a kind of a partner, an advisor. He helps in the astro imaging efforts that I might have. He offers expertise, and it's kind of fun to talk about it that way. But the cool thing, he does it without any additional costs for most of us. And so I guess I could formally introduce you. There's a good chance maybe you know him, or you've heard of him, or you've heard of his exploits. So I want to give you, I can't hear you clapping because I can't hear that. But anyway, Mr. Histogram. He exists for the sole purpose of helping us capture and process, for us, better dark images. This presentation is really for all who would like to image with a digital camera. And I guess today that's probably pretty much everybody, but it's especially interesting or useful for those that have the audacity to attempt to capture and image the night sky, or those that would like to or understand it. So this is important. It's probably most useful for those that have or use a DSLR, but it applies in the processing so many different areas. Understanding the imaging of a histogram is probably the single most important concept to become familiar with when you're working with digital cameras. It can tell you so much. It can tell you about whether you're properly exposed, whether your lighting is either too harsh, too flat, too bright, too much contrast, too little. It tells you about the data you've captured. Is it what you image? Is it going to be recoverable or not? And adjustments, what kind of adjustments may work best? So we have a little bit of a difficulty within astrophotography, and it's because of the light. But normally we think of astrophotography as one half capturing the image, and about another half doing the editing and processing. Well, the cool thing about this is that the histogram can actually help with both. Not everybody uses it for both, but maybe it would be a good idea to consider that. So our problem is quite a bit different than what other photographers have. And daylight photography like this, it's amazing. 1/100th of a second, and you can get a beautiful image with all kinds of colors and tones, and the histogram is full. And that looks awful pretty, that looks pretty good. In astrophotography, however, you can shoot 5, 10, 15 more minutes, and this is what your image will look like. And that's the challenge we have. It's because we are capturing very, very, very few photons. So we look at this challenge. Capturing and editing is, in a sense, probably one of the most difficult kind of processes you can do for mankind. It is trying to capture that night sky and to do a good job at it. Many people spend years doing that. So capturing a good image is one thing, but then the second half of the game is how do you edit it? And as was explained earlier, with the same data, you can come up with quite a few different results. So everything changes when you do the editing. You could end up results that are good, bad, or maybe I don't even want to talk about it. But Histo, our friend, is here to help. Here's an example of a histogram from an image from a nightscape. And the question is that good or is that better? Or what do we do with that? Well, this presentation is going to deal with starting out with some fundamentals about the histogram to help understand what it is, what it can do. And then I'll get into some of the essential things that if you understand them, they will help towards some of the imaging solutions. And at the end, we'll have some practical getaways, takeaways, and some summaries and questions. So let's start with the some of the fundamentals. First off, what is a histogram? Well, a lot of people think of it as like a bar chart. It's very similar, except that a histogram has a continuous relation of the data that goes across the horizontal axis. It's continuous, and in our case, it refers to tones, tones that are captured. The nice thing about it, it can observe huge amounts of data and present it on a simple 2D graph, millions of parts, and put it together very quickly. It allows us to observe and understand, and for us, perhaps even just and manipulate some of that data for use. Of course, it's used in all sciences to measure quantities or values, everything from statistics, business, agriculture, politics. It's used just about everywhere. So if we take a look at a histogram, here's an example that might be in there. And in this particular example, it looks like it's covering pretty much the whole area of that histogram, that white area in the curve. Well, the question is that good, or what should it be? And how do you know what to do with that? The one on the right looks good, but how does that actually work? Well, it's a distribution of certain values or tones in the photos. So where does this data come from? Now, it's way beyond the presentation of this class, but if you were to look at it this way, to make it real simple, you have photons coming down into a lens, and when it comes down into a lens, eventually it will come down into an area where there's an image sensor, and that may have little micro lenses to help focus it better. There may be filters or may not be colored filters underneath, and then it'll eventually reach the pixel down on the bottom. And in the pixel, there's a photosite there that is sensitive to the photons. And due to the photoelectric effect from Einstein back in 1905, the photon hitting that can release an electron. The electrons can build up below in that bucket. It's usually called a potential well. And at the end of the exposure, however many electrons are in there are taken out. And the voltage that is a result of that is given a number. Now, up to this point, you have actual data that's captured. After it's given a number, you just have the number to work with. But that number is going to be a value of how many electrons were put in that well. If there were none, it would be 0 and black. If it were completely full, it would be white, or anywhere in between. So if we look at a histogram, the bottom part, which we were talking about, that little histogram, he's kind of cute. My granddaughter loves that guy. Anyway, on the black, on the left side, all the way to the white, is a distribution of those tones that the camera is able to capture. The vertical axis is how many of those tones are there for each tonal level. The maximum is not how many you have, but whatever is the brightest. So that's an example of that. So let's take a look at some of the terminology that is used for the histogram. First thing, it's most obvious, is there's a peak, usually in a histogram, some peak, and that's going to be up at the top. Well, that represents the shade or the tone. Sometimes it's referred to as a skyfog peak, the hump, mountain background, sky peak, things like that. Next thing, there's from left to right, there's an intensity value for 0 all the way on the left, which would be black, all the way through the midtones gray up to white on the right, which would be 100%. Another thing on the graph, and probably the second most important thing to know about a histogram, is the standard deviation. Now, don't worry about what that means. It's not a mathematical term for us. You have to worry about it. Essentially, half the width, halfway up, which describes the nature of the curve itself, the signal that we're capturing, and that will become really important when we do the editing. So that's something to be aware of. We then have something referred to as the head, which will be the brightest tones that were received by the image, and the foot will be the darkest. And if you go in between those, it's a dynamic range. Now, it's not the dynamic range of the camera, but it's the dynamic range of the image that you've captured. Then there's those slopes that go up towards the peak, the shoulders, and those are important when we do editing. And then lastly is something referred to as the separation. Now, the separation is very, very important. It's going to be very critical when you're capturing, and even more critical perhaps when you're doing the editing, what happens there, because that's a safety zone that's going to become very critical to understand. All right, so what about this peak, the signal itself? Again, the sky fog peak or mountain. That is very important, but there's two other sides that are also critically important. That's that left side, which is black, and the right side, which was white. Now, don't think of it as, okay, I've got a black sheet of paper and I got a white sheet of paper, and maybe there's stuff on there. Well, no, that would be a misunderstanding. If anything gets to the black, goes beyond there, that means there's nothing, no detail, nothing whatsoever. It's lost. It's like it's gone into a black hole. It's gone. You've lost it. And on the right, it's completely white. Well, there's nothing you can add to the completely white to add. There's no detail. There's nothing. So it's very critical when you think about the histogram. If you go beyond either edges, it's lost. It's gone. And you have the peak, and those edges are probably the most important thing to initially concentrate on. All right, if we take a look at that scale, that intensity scale that went from 1 to 100, on the back of or on the window of a DSLR, there's usually a histogram, and most software will have one as well. But usually that's divided up into 256 different shades from the left to the right, and that's based on an 8-bit JPEG or VGA type of image. So you have 256 from 0 to 255, that many shades that you can deal with. Well, of course, most of us have cameras that shoot something better than JPEGs. We may have a 12-bit. Well, a 12-bit, 2 to the 12th would be 4096. That means you have 4096 shades. Well, that can't fit on that graph. So each one of those gray tones on will represent 16 different tones. If you have a 14-bit, each one will represent 64 tones. So that becomes then a highly compressed a histogram, and we realize that there's a lot more there than is visible. So that becomes really important when we do their editing. If you have a 16-bit, wow, you're going to have 65,000 tones. You have a lot of information. 32-bit, you come up with what, 4.3, I think it's trillion. That's like 4,000 times the number of stars in the Milky Way. It's a huge number. But the point is, it's highly compressed, but that's what we have to work with and capture. All right. What about the signal itself? That curve. There's some things that are important. The signal, which is the intensity or the tonal values, is captured and converted to a number, and the quantity of that number is the height. For Astro images, we try to think of the signal as coming from outer space. It's captured on the sensor, and we can capture that information, and that's what we're trying to process. And there's other things that happen. Well, that's true. You are capturing a signal from outer space, with its color and contrast, but you're capturing a whole lot more than that. You're capturing way beyond what the signal is. We will at this point just refer to that as noise. It could be a light from a neighbor's porch. It could be the light pollution in the sky. It could be some thermal reaction from your camera itself or the tube. Whatever is not supposed to be there, we'll just refer to noise at this point. So when you look at a histogram, understand you're seeing much more than just the exposure. But it's kind of a super tool, a window that you can look at and look through and look at the captured image and then do some processing with it later. So you have the peak, which is very important. And then that's a major part of your signal. Now, if you look at it, well, let's just go to the rest part. You have this separation again. The separation will become important and why I'll illustrate that a little bit later. And of course, the standard deviation. Let's take a look at a typical image that would come from, for example, a DSLR. Now, this is loaded in some kind of processing program. The first thing you might notice, it is way to the left, more so than it might even show on a histogram on DSLR. And the reason is most raw processing software will apply a nonlinear tone curves to give it a standard look and feel. So what you see here, don't worry about it at this point, but it is very far to the left. However, you still have a peak and you still have a separation, and you've got it looks like something that's important on that part above. But you ask yourself, what about that peak? What really is that peak? Is that peak your image? Well, if you're imaging the night sky, what is most of the night sky? Well, it's going to be the background sky. It's usually the darker area. It's not the image that you're trying to capture, unless you're trying to capture the night dark sky. And but the point is what really is the color of the night sky? It's not where your bright reds are. That's where your black is. In outer space, the night sky is as black as black could be. Now, a lot of people don't like to look at it that way because we look through the Earth's atmosphere and it doesn't look quite as black, which is fine. It's okay. But in outer space, it would be. The point is, what your image is not at that peak. That's not the data that you want. What you're concerned about is from that peak over as it slides over to the right. And that is where your data is. Now, in this case, it looks like most of it would be very, very low and not very bright. It would be a very minimal amount, depending on your image. From the left to that is things that are darker than the background sky. Now, maybe you have some dark, dark clouds or something. So there may be information there, but it's also possible, depending on the type of image you're trying to capture, that would be some of the light pollution that is could be subtracted. Well, we'll find out. We'll see what we can do with that. So the background level, you have the peak. Now, when you're imaging, that peak, the location of that background peak, is part of what we think of as our exposure. The exposure, of course, is the amount of light that can be captured by your camera through the lens. So it's a combination of two things. And you have the aperture, which is the size of your lens, or whatever you're using, and possibly a relationship with the F ratio if you do something there. And you have the exposure length. The exposure length is, or the speed, shutter speed. Those together will allow, if you increase it, will allow that peak to move to the right. There is another way to move that peak to the right, and that is by changing your gain or ISO for a DSLR. There's going to be a serious drawback of that, which I'll illustrate a little bit later. But that can also move it. The point is that all of those three things can change it But the only two that will actually capture more photons are the changing of the aperture or your shutter speed. The gain does not allow any more. I mean, the screen gets brighter. It's an amplification of that of what your screen is, an electronic amplification. Now you have to have some amplification, otherwise the camera doesn't work. So there's usually a recommended one where the sensitivity is greatest and you can capture the best image. But most of us have what we call ISO stops, where we can go above or below that. And so we'll see what happens when we try to do that. Well, you put that all together, and Mr. Histo takes it from there, and in a matter of seconds comes up with a histogram of what you've imaged and what your exposure is. Again, the adjustment, you can adjust it, amplify it by the ISO, but that does not actually collect any more photons. It doesn't collect any more data. So you'll take a test exposure. Now, let's take a look at one of the things you can do is stretching. Mr. Histogram, stretch that. There you go. Appreciate that. We like to do the stretching because that then, if you look at from where that peak was, the data has stretched, especially to the right, where most of the image is likely to be. And that allows it to be placed into more tones. And so we'll get more into stretching, what happens with that later, but that's a really good thing that we can, otherwise we wouldn't be able to have very many nice images in outer space at all. All right, let's go to some of the essential understandings that will help us in imaging. I see two, perhaps three, that are going to be relevant here. One is precise exposures and noise, and actually processing adjustments fits into both of those exposures and the noise. So it's kind of three. So the question is, what can we do that using the histogram that would be good? Well, let's start by looking at a histogram. Here's one of the Milky Way. And as you can see, the histogram here, there's a little separation on the left side, and it looks like there's room on the right. So you ask yourself, oh, is that good? Or is that bad? Or can it be better? Or what should you do? What does the histogram tell you? Well, it's a good question. What about this? Is this good or is this bad? Well, it may depend. Let's see if we can figure out why. If we look at it, the histogram there is over to the right. And we have to say, well, you know, on Earth, we're usually told that the image to the right, you'll get a better image if you expose to the right. Well, does that same thing apply in outer space? That's a good question. Let's see if we can figure that out. Here's a histogram showing an image with different exposures. One at about 12%, 25%, 50%, and about 75%. So the question becomes, which exposure is best? Again, if you increase your exposure, you can move it to the right. So you have that ability. But where should you put it? Which one is best? What's a good thing? What do you have to know or understand to understand that? Well, let's separate out all four here by looking at them. If we look at the C, by the way, on a banner on the top, means it is a kind of a critical concept that's worth understanding here. Remember, the peak is not where, the peak is where most of the data is, but it's not where your image is. So if the image goes to the right, well, you may want to protect that most. So maybe the number 75%, maybe we have to look closer, but that might be so far to the right that we're going to destroy the image. So we might not want to go that far. What about that 12% one? Is that good? Or if we stretch it, are we going to lose something? Or are we going to clip? Well, that's where the histogram will come in to help you make that decision. Now, what you want to do is you don't want to expose to the right. And the reason is, let's see if I can show an example here. in the details, and in this case, most of the details won't be on the peak. They'll be very close to the bottom in this particular one because there's very few details. It looks like there's a couple galaxies, and there'll only be a few humps. But that's where you're going to have to look in those details. Now, exposing to the right could be a problem. Let's say you have a DSLR. A lot of DSLRs, you know, some of them are absolutely amazing. The Canon 1DX, for example, Mark III, they have an ISO range from 100 to 102,000, and an extended range all the way up to what, 819,000, something like that. The one I have on the left here, if you take a look at this example, this is a Canon 5D Mark III, one similar that I have, and if I were to take an image at an ISO 3200, I have, if you look to the left on that chart there, I have 10 stops that camera is able to capture. Faster ones are pretty close to that same. But let's say I want to image the night sky, and I have and I don't have a guider or something for tracking the sky. And you say, okay, well, I want to catch something out there. So you take your ISO and click it up. 3, maybe 4. You click it up 3 or 4 steps to get up to 25,000, which is the bottom one. Now, if you look at that on the right, that graph becomes really critical because it says, hey, originally I had 10 stops. Now I only have 5 stops. You might think, well, okay, 5 stops. Well, I still have half of what I had. You know, I still probably turn out pretty good. No, that's not quite the way it works. What happens is from stop 10 to stop 9 is half. 9 is half of 10. When you go from 9 to 8, that 8 is half of 9. When you go down, you're getting half of half of a half of a half of a half. You're down to only 3% of the tonal ranges that you had when you had 10 stops. 3%, it's like having $100 in the bank and you only can spend $3. You know, it's like it's misuse of the camera. So you don't want to be able to take it down where you're dropping the ISO down to where it's causing a serious effect on your dynamic range. So one of the things, if you haven't done so and you own a camera, make sure you have a graph like that so you know exactly where you should be imaging it, and try to keep that, again, ISO as high as possible. The dynamic range will change drastically. Now, a lot of people, there's a lot of noise out there now about, for example, Sony has, a lot of the cameras are invariant. And the thought is that, hey, I could expose at all these different ranges and still come up with the same result. Well, technically, what they're saying is that you can underexpose it and then increase the exposure in post, and you'll come up with pretty close to the same. And that's true. But if you look at it here, in this particular case, you go down those stops and, well, you've gone down 3 stops. Well, 3 stops, is that bad? Well, half of a half of a half. You're down to 1/8. 1/8. That's just, you know, that's a small percentage of what you originally have. So why throw away all those tones unless you only want to have white and black stars and nothing else much in between? So increasing the ISO is going to be a problem. And the reason is, as you can see down below, if you have a 12-bit camera, or normally you would have 4096, you go down 4 stops, you only have 256 tones or levels you're going to be able to work with. And that becomes a critical thing to understand. All right. So we have some idea of an underexposed and maybe an overexposed image with a histogram. And you can tell one on the top is underexposed. Well, it's all against that black line. So probably there's a lot of data that was never captured. It wasn't exposed long enough to even capture it. The one on the right was exposed long enough, but maybe too much. You have to look and see if you're losing anything. One way to do that is if you look over at this, I don't know if you can see, there's a little peak right here that goes up on that, and that little peak, you have to just look at that and say, is that information valuable or good, or what do I want to do with it? Middle exposure is normally taken here. Again, the data to the right, you want to leave a little bit more room, but you must leave the separation on the left. And that's a good start without the clipping. Now, it's not always going to work. Here's an example of a DSLR image of M42, the Orion Nebula. Now, at first you're looking at that. Well, if you're a beginner, it's a great shot. You've done a good job trying to capture something, and stars are round and all those kind of things. But if you look at it more closely, you start realizing, okay, yeah, but if you look at that histogram, that's all, we're all over here on the black side, and that means all this black here is probably lost data. There's probably some information there that you threw away because the exposure was not long enough, or in processing you cut it out. And then the next thing is you look at this area here. Wow, that's where the trapezium is, and over here that's probably this is cut out too. So what do you do? Well, you need to change your exposure, find a camera that have maybe a different dynamic range you can work with. But you can still even do something even if you have a DSLR like that. And there's multiple things you can do. Let's see if we can take a look at some possible things. Here you have clipping both on the black and the white during editing. So for what it's worth, a lot of people would think dynamic range is the most important thing in life for a imager. Well, that's probably not true, but sometimes you feel that way. Not too many people do it, but one thing you could do is some kind of adjustment because you don't have a camera that can handle it. You take a look at this. Now here's the exposure range of the human eye, about 20 stops. Actually, somewhere, most of them have it even higher to 24. And that doesn't even take into account the visual purple that goes over the rods when you're getting night vision. That can go up to, some people have measured it up to 46 different stops. Huge dynamic range that you can see. A really good camera, a high-end camera, maybe has 14 stops worth. Think of the EV as a stop at this point. And maybe a regular consumer camera, 7. Now you might think, okay, I've got a good camera, 14 stops, and that can capture most of what we see. Well, not quite. 14 to 20 is not 6. It's 14 to 15 is double. 15 to 16 is double. 16 to 17. So you're talking about 64. Your eye can see 64 times more levels than your camera can produce. And that extends in, especially in the mid-range, but all through, especially in the dark range, which is what we would image at. So that becomes pretty important. And you can see, again, here's 5 steps down. You started with 2048, and that particular, you only got 64 channels to work with. That's not very good. One thing you can do is try, if you were interested, try to do a high dynamic range image. I'm not sure if this was a Hubble image or not, but I don't think it was. But you can see there's a tremendous amount of data compared to the other one, where you can see the light filaments that were in that image. And also, here's for nightscapes, high dynamic range. Televisions are now coming out within the last couple of years now. The protocols have changed to increase from about 25 to 30% of what your eye sees up to 75% on the newer monitors, the HDR monitors that are coming out. So this will be actually closer and even better than some of the monitors we use in our editing. So it's worth getting images that will be able to be displayed on that. So how do you take an image like that? Well, you could buy a camera that has a better sensor, more depth. That's an expensive way to go. Maybe even an Astro camera that's more sensitive and gives you a larger dynamic range. You could try taking multiple images, getting more data, which will allow you to stretch more and have less noise. Or you just take multiple exposures, each with at different exposure settings. It's the old HDR kind of trick. For example, just to give you an example, you're probably very familiar with, if you take a picture inside to out like that, you expose it to the outside, well, the inside is highly underexposed. You expose to the inside, the outside is highly overexposed. You put it in the middle, well, it's still not good enough because your camera doesn't have the dynamic range. So it's still overexposed and underexposed. So how in the world do you come up with something like that where both of them look good? Well, one of the things you can do if you wanted to give it a shot is exposed high to begin with, which will allow you to capture the brighter things, and expose low, which will allow you to capture the darker indoor things, and then put them together, maybe even a third one in between, and you can come up with something like that. Now, that takes a lot more work, but it is something that you could do to improve it. Well, what does that look like on a histogram? And why would you even think about doing that? Here's a histogram. If you were to take just a middle tone picture, you would end up with something like that. If you look at that histogram, all the data is like almost all to the left or all to the right. That means it's very high contrast, but you've lost almost all your detail. When you get really high contrast, that's exactly what you lose. Things have gone off the edge, and so you've lost all your detail. If you take with the dark tones on top and then with the light tones on the bottom and put them together, you can get something that will show all those details. And it will end up being closer to the one on the right. Now, I'm not saying you can equal the Hubble Space Telescope picture, but you can get a lot closer to it. That's kind of cool. And that's by putting together several to get that kind of images. All right, we love to stretch. And Ryan, pre-stretching, which can be done, and then in post-processing, you have different stretches and curves you can add to it. Without that, we would be in rough shape. So that's something we need to or want to do. We couldn't bring out the faint details, but we need to be careful how we do it. Now, I'm going to ask here, Mr. Histo, would you stretch that for me? I appreciate it. Okay, there you go. Thanks. Okay, he stretched it so we have a lot more tones to be able to work with that were hidden before. And now we can actually display them. But there's a problem. If you look at that, we've now stretched beyond the black and beyond the white, and we're going to be losing some detail either in the dark or the black. So the histogram will end up looking like this. If you're looking at your histogram and you see clipping on the black side, that means best case scenario, you got rid of a light pollution, but more likely or worst case scenario, you've also lost some data. And that's where, since we're night sky, a lot of things are very, very faint, and that may be a lot of the things you want to capture. So that's when you do that adjustment, you need to watch for that clipping. Same thing on the right side. Now, if you look at that white one, you need to ask yourself, all right, I've clipped some of the white. Is that important? Now, if it's just a few stars, well, you know, there are a lot of white stars in the sky. Maybe that will be acceptable. In this case, it looks like there's another galaxy there. So you're completely blowing out the galaxy. So that's not acceptable. So you would need to watch that for the clipping. Expanding, again, if you look at this, all of a sudden where the peaks are spread, now you have a little lip on the far right. Where did that come from? Well, if you look, it came way back from here. This was stretched. Was it stretched too far? Well, it looks like it was, depending on what that part of the image was. So let's take a look. When you're capturing, what should you do? Let's say you have a DSLR and you want to capture your image. You shoot an image and you test. You look at it and say, if you're getting something like that in the histogram, you do another test and you move it and you increase your exposure length, hopefully with the aperture or the shutter length, the last case scenario with the ISO. And you try to capture, you move that over there. So that becomes really important when you're doing your capture. Take a test, capture, see what you have. Don't wait till you get inside and process and realize, well, I just wasted a night's worth of work and I'm not going to get results. So there are other challenges. One of them is a color challenge, especially for DSLRs. And that's because the luminosity histogram is not the right choice if you're trying to image the night sky where there's color, like a choice. And the perceived brightness is going to be different. There's a higher red channel is going to be shifted. Let me explain that. Here's an histogram with an RGB, and you can see, okay, it looks like the blue is clever, but that's, pretty, other than the blue being on the dark side, you've got everything pretty much there. But it's the RGB channel histogram that will give you the real capture linear values that you're capturing. The luminosity will not. So if all you're doing is looking at the luminosity, you're going to find out you're going to have a struggle with it. You have a problem. Well, some people will take and they'll look at the color channels and they say, hey, what? Hey, they're offset. Isn't the night sky black? Isn't it dark? I mean, how come I've got green, blue, and wow, I got a cheap camera, I'm gonna get a new, no, well, it's not that. You need to expect that. Some people will even suggest, okay, well, you take that and you move the red over into the green and line it and then increase them. And, well, okay. Yeah, maybe, if you're shooting a night, a black nebula or something like that, but it's going to be wrong, because if you're shooting a color image, you've just wiped out your color. So what's happening? How would you deal with that? Well, another one is related. You shoot a DSLR, and this was what shows up in your computer. You see red, well, which is what most commonly will show up, and you're thinking, oh, gee, what a dumb camera. Why am I getting red here? Why can't I get something better? Well, it's actually doing that on purpose. And why? Well, it has to do with how color is transferred from black and white. If you look at that color image, all the green, red, and blue ones all look different. So, what is going on? Well, it was a long time ago, back in the 1940s and 50s, when television was becoming color, they had to realize, well, if they did it directly, the colors didn't look correct. And so they realized the luminosity, they had to multiply the red, green, and blue times different amounts and give them different weights. Red is times 3, green almost 6, 0.59, and 0.11. So you have different values that your camera is producing to be able to make it look like it's normal. You ever wonder why a Bayer matrix has 2 green for every 1 red and 1 blue? It's because your eyes are much more sensitive to the green, so it needs to produce that more, and then actually the blue is inhibited more than the red. So anyway, this is a physiological thing that works with DSLR cameras, but it's something you need to deal with a nighttime object. So that does a couple things. Because we use that in a DSLR that's called gamma encoding, it also changes what the histogram is showing. RGB data, for example, a 255 that was white moves down all the way to 186. And that's why if you look at that little bleep on the bottom right down there, it says it's a clip signal. And you're saying, hey, it's on the chart. How can it be clipped? Well, it is clipped. And the reason is because you have been using gamma encoding on it. And the midpoint isn't even listed. The midpoint is moved. If this is the midpoint, when after the gamma encoding, it's actually shifted way up here, close to 3/4 of the way. So things you have to the right, especially when you start stretching it, are going to go off to the right into no man's land much, much faster. So that's something you need to watch out for when you do your editing. Now, to prove that, I can just show you this with some flowers. This is a high contrast flowers with the roses, and it's white clip. If you look at it closely, you can see, well, here's the red. You can see that it actually shows that the red is clipped. But if you look at the luminosity histogram, well, it shows you got a lot of room there. And you would think, hey, this is a fine exposure. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, it won't turn out that way because of the gamma encoding in the red. To prove it closer, if you're looking close, what have you lost? You lost all the detail in the roses. Another way of looking at that is when you look at your histograms, if you look to the high contrast, which is what that is, will show up where the sides of the histogram are going to be overexposed. Big differences between white and black, and flatter to up on the sides. And yet the same graph will show that, hey, you've got plenty of room in your luminosity. There's 0 pixels showing there. And you've got a separation, so you think you're fine. But on both sides on your color, you've gone over. So how in the heck do you check for it? Well, you can check for it as you're doing the editing. Now, I don't use the Photoshop for editing, but I'm also told that if you hold the Alt key down in levels or raw, and as you move the white point slider, it will show you immediately when it goes clipping. So that's a little hint that's worth giving a shot. Also, if you use a DSLR and your camera, turn on the clipping color, so it will show on your viewfinder, and then you can even back off from that on your exposure a little bit. Another thing from Roger Clark has showed me that when you do curves, and to try to get rid of, remember, air glow and light pollution is often to the left of that. So you can get rid of that, but you can also do the color balancing at the same time by changing it to RGB. Let's see if I can get it up here. There we go. Change this to an RGB channel, and then your 3 channels will be unaligned down here, and you bring them together at the point, and it will do the balancing for you. A real simple way to adjust that. Remember, red 59, green is 30, blue is 11, and that will also happen if you use individual colors with your for your imaging, or even ultra high contrast filter. You just have to look and find out how is that affecting that. All right, noise. I kind of think of noise it's kind of like snoring. If it's persistent and loud, it's always irritating. For many of us, it's like the mother of all battles that we will try to make sure we win before we finish processing our images. But the essence of processing it will bring additional noise, but you need to know how to deal with that. So let me take a stab at that. There are 3 primary sources for noise, and they'll show up one way or another on the histogram. One is a photon noise, or sometimes referred to as a shot noise. Then there's a front end or upstream read noise, and there's a back and downstream noise. Once it's converted to a number, then you have your downstream noise. The point is that there's a statistical nature to noise. The most significant noise will have a statistical nature to it. And by understanding that statistical nature, you'll be able to observe how the signal to noise ratio changes as you change your exposure, integrate more information, or apply noise reduction. Think of it as, well, it's not uniform. In the same way, here I can show you, the same way that rain would fall like on a driveway, light will fall on your sensor. The rains don't all fall in a nice uniform spot. They're kind of random all over the place. Well, that kind of happens with light as well. And you have that bucket, that well, potential well, that's going to fill up with, in our case, photons. If there are very few, it's black. I don't know how I did that, but I guess I can go undo that. There it is. If you fill it all the way up, it's white, and in between is probably, you know, an area that's going to be good. So what happens? Well, let's try this. If you take and were to look at just one photon going on a pixel, that first picture in the upper left is what you would get. Notice it's almost all noise. You can barely even recognize the image. If you collect 4 photons, well, now you're being able to see an image come out, but it's still very random and very, very noisy. 16, 64, it's a lot better. Now all of a sudden you can see it. You have 100, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000. Well, you're gonna get 20,000 to 50,000. Kind of fills the bucket. However many electrons our bucket is for our camera. So that becomes really important. Most important is less noise or looking over a saturated. If it's not full, if you don't have enough electrons in it, you're going to have a lot of noise. So now I could go into that a lot. That's kind of another presentation. How do you adjust your exposure to reduce the noise using the histogram and things like that? But what I would like to do at this point is at least show you one of the conclusions. And obviously, probably most of you are familiar with that. You've heard it many times over and over. Take more subframes. Well, here's the numbers. If you take 4 subframes, now you've reduced the noise by 2. That's 1/2 the noise. 9, 1/3 the noise. 25, 1/5. 100, 1/10 the amount of noise. And that's how you can get much better images. So you collect more, longer exposure, or many more, depending on your sky conditions. When you're doing planets, my gosh, to get as low noise as possible, you might take 20,000 frames because they're small, easy to process, to reduce it as much. So the more subframes you're adding in, the more real data you're getting, and the smoother will be that with that noise. Again, it's the more you add, it's kind of like throwing pennies. If I were to throw down 3 pennies, one might be heads, 2 might be a tail, or 2 might be tails, 1 might be a head, or maybe they're all heads or all tails. You're not 50%. We keep throwing more down, I'll get closer and closer to that 50%. If I throw down 1,000, it gets closer and closer. That's the law of large numbers. You're getting closer and closer to that 50%. The same thing happens with the imaging from the photons coming from outer space. All right, let's take a look at this standard deviation. Now, when we stretch, we're making that distribution wider. That standard deviation is getting larger. Again, it's just a number that relates how wide that is. If we look at that, it's very close to a Poisson distribution, that shape. And so a lot of programs will use that idea mathematically to try to be able to figure out how to not just expand it, but how to reduce some of the noise and things like that. And it produces this Gaussian behavior. Okay, here's the peak again, and here's the standard deviation. So noise is going to be a problem. If you notice that it's been separated a little bit now that we've run it, and the shape, the shoulders are different, the head's different. Well, looking a little bit closer, compare it. Here's what you've got. Here's a standard deviation of 0.025. You double it, twice the width. Wow, those lines aren't as clean. The shoulders are broader, and even more so, the top is worse. It's not clean. You've added noise just by stretching it. It was there, but you've added it, made it visible. Now, standard deviation of 0, to show you how this could actually work, is going to be nice and clean, but no detail. So that's not very good. So when you look at several, as the standard deviation increases, you can see the noise increases. All right. How much noisier the top one is. Now look at it close. Also, the peaks get wider. Now that's the real key, because the peaks will tell you a lot about the quality of the image. If you look at it close, standard deviation, wow, those peaks, look how much noisier that 0.05 is. So what can you do when you want to bring out those tones? So what do? Well, you look at your histogram, find ways to reduce the noise after stretching, but to keep the same contrast. Here's an example of a stretching. With a very narrow, notice the image on the left is a nice clean image, but there's no contrast. It's hard to recognize anything. You stretched it, now you've got contrast. You can start seeing some of the details in there, but it's noisy. Oh, okay, again, that's frustrating. You look at the peaks, okay, now your peak has gotten wider, all right? The contrast, the background, noises, everything's increased, so you made it worse. Not really, you have made it look worse, but you've added the contrast is what your image needs. Now, there are a lot of things that in processing people will do. For example, normalization. If you do a normalization, notice the way that increases or spreads out the histogram, all right? And it adds contrast, but there's a lot of holes in it. And here's an example of equalization. Histogram, that gets even wider too. Doing equalization for contrast enhancement, all of a sudden that has an effect of, it adds contrast, but it flattens it, and because it's bringing up the edges. So you see, wow, okay, I'm making it worse while I'm trying to make it better. Well, it looks that way at this point, but that's where the second half of this will come into play. Increased contrast, remember, it brings everything's up on the sides. Sometimes it's good, like for example, that black and white photo. Sometimes it'll be over, for example, for the high contrast image we showed below. And it's not going to be, what you want. So how do you go from something like this to a histogram that is narrower, and now the peak, instead of wild all over the place, is nice and pointed? That nice and pointed will be means you'll have a good image. You can look at the image first, or look at the histogram. Well, there's a number of ways of doing it. Some people will use different types of noise reduction, noise software like denoise from such with the T labs, adding Gaussian blurs and things like that. The point is, you need to do something to narrow that various ways, and here's what the effect will be. If you can narrow that, the peak will get smaller, the histogram will get smaller, but it's moved over and you've left your higher tones there. The shoulders are now less, so it will become clearer. And that standard deviation is caused it to be smaller. And that's going to end up being a clearer image, just like you see on the top. So there's, again, noise routines for reducing that is another presentation. But looking at the histogram, you can see that's what needs to be done. All right, the histogram does a number of other things real quickly. One, it can show your hot pixels, you know, down there. These kind of things will show up. Also, impositional noise. You know, maybe you're one that would take your electrical cord from your dew heater and it run past the camera. Understand that electricity isn't the electrons going through the wire, it's the field around the wire. And that field, if you have it next to a camera, can be picked up on the camera and you can get noise in that. Now, one way to first move the cord away from your camera, but also you can get rid of that through various means, using a bad pixel map or using your dark frames and stuff like that. So those things are recognizable in your histogram. Close to last is this. When I first put this picture up, it probably looked pretty good to you. But your eyes are kind of amazing. If you look at something for more than a few seconds, all of a sudden it starts noticing detail. And if you're looking at it now, you're probably saying, oh, gee, there's banding in that sky. Well, that same thing happens with our astro images. Banding on the left and on the right, there's color banding. Well, the more pixel tone values you have in the histogram, whenever you have that then you have levels of brightness, you'll have banding. I can illustrate it this way. Here's a picture where there are 50 shades of gray. It says 28 to 78. There's 50 shades of gray, and yet it's 450 pixels wide. Well, it looked nice when you first looked at it, but if you look at it close now, it's got to go at least 9 pixels before it can go to the next shade. So you're going to get banding. The same thing happens in your astro images. So what will that look like? If you look like, you'll see gaps like this on your histogram. Or even more so, maybe they'll be as drastic as something like this. And that's obviously just not enough data. So let's put it this way. Any photograph that you are trying, anytime you're trying to photograph something that's black, like the night sky, with a digital camera, and you push it, especially in software, to make it visible until you have a light color, you will get banding. As you can see, there's color, and you look at that and say, wow, it's a lousy camera. No, it's not a lousy camera. It's just that you took one image that did not have enough depth to it. You need to take multiple exposures and stack them and subtract the dark frames, and then you can get rid of that banding and get rid of that noise. So how to remove it? Well, there's a number of ways. One thing, just real quickly, you could convert it to a 16-bit, gives yourself more leeway, add some Gaussian blur. A better way, of course, is to start with a better image, better capture up front. There's more than ways. So last thing, what are some practical takeaways that we covered? Just very quickly, the histogram shows all kinds of details, but it's only 8 bits. It's not 16, so it's compressed. When you need extra dynamic range, you capture multiple frames and then stack them and add the precision. The things you've been heard. Key point, if you're shooting a DSLR, RGB data is gamma encoded. Therefore, it seldom will align. Don't expect it to align. Look at your RGB histogram. Luminosity is not going to show it in detail. Again, you can use added contrast. There's a lot you can do with it. The standard deviation, the width increases. That increases contrast, but it also increases noise. Remove sources that are power sources from your camera. If you have a one-shot color camera, look at the histogram, not the RGB, not the other luminous one. During capture, allow enough separation on the left side, because you're going to start. Now, you might have light pollution, but there also might be a good amount of signal. So that needs to be increased. Confirm the separation and that you have room enough on the left or the right. So set your exposure based on where you should. And once you get used to that, you'll know about what that should be. You can learn to use the Alt key if you use the Photoshop. Longer total exposure times. If you live in a dark site, longer exposures can actually help. In a light polluted sky, shorter will have the exact same effect as longer exposures. But you need to collect more data. So deciding during capture, acquire more subs. Make that decision ahead of time. Go for a lower signal to noise ratio. It's all about capturing more photons. Stacking adds frames, and reduce noise to your histogram. How many? I don't know. 20, I would think, would be a minimum, but you can go as high as you like. During capture, if you want to, you can try high dynamic range or try different types of techniques, or that your images that you're capturing may have to be different. On clipping, watch obviously for clipping during your editing process. A lot of people will edit and they'll just look at the image and see is it good or bad. Well, look and see what's happening. It will let you know how much you can do and was not acceptable, and when a different procedure will be important. Carefully look for banding in the background, especially in the midtones. That means you don't have enough data. And again, increasing your standard deviation will increase your contrast, but also increase your noise. Look for the jagged edges and the top of that peak and reduce those afterwards. So in summary, there's a lot of different shapes. There are a lot of different ways to look at histograms. Do it for a while, you get used to it. But the point is, it will help you with your exposure level, with clipping, noise characteristics, your curves, Gaussian patterns, color channel offsets, your dynamic range and how you can set those, your color balancing themselves, image contrast and what to watch for when you're overdoing it, and use it to watch for hot pixels and things like that. So in the end, that is a pretty powerful guy, probably a lot smarter than we gave him credit for. Histogram, and I give you the end.
Thank you. Eric, what do we got in the way of questions?
Oh, we got a couple of questions here. Chandrasekhar was asking, do you know what the Hubble Space Telescope or James Webb Space Telescope histograms look like? And just from, I think, most of our experience, those histograms you show are a lot broader than what we normally get in our astrophotography. So I guess that's two questions. Do you know what the Hubble Space Telescope histograms look like, the raw histograms?
I don't have any copies myself. They'll normally, if you look at their data, they'll have individual ones that you can download. I have not seen anybody show me a histogram of their final edited work. But again, if you want to work with the Hubble ones, you can go online and download some of that data and play with it and work with it. But I don't have a copy of a finished one.
You can actually download all the Space Telescope data from.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, I mean, no, you can, not just Hubble, but actually all the big telescope data is available to anyone on the Mikowski archive. But that's another subject.
Eric, Eric, hold on for a second, because I looked this up for Chandrasekhar while during the program. If you go to the Astro Imaging Channel website, the astroimagingchannel.org, and you go to Program Database, all right, and you go to the spreadsheet, you wind up in the spreadsheet, and I've already done that for you. So let's go right here, and then you look up. No, I don't need to download that again. God, I've downloaded that a half a dozen times. Anyway, if you look up Hubble, for instance, find Hubble. Yeah, I did that already today. So here you can get Joe De Pasquale on the 9th of November, 2020, did a whole program on, well, he's the guy that actually processes the Hubble data and images. And I don't remember if he actually had examples of the histogram there. But if you're interested in that, there is one place to get information about what the Hubble pictures look like when you first get them. Just not, 3 weeks ago, Eric, you put on a show, I'm not sure if it's already been annotated here, where you talked about how to use data from the space science telescopes and things like that. Okay.
Yeah, but those are all stacked images. I think what the question is what does a single exposure look like?
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. I don't remember if it was in De Pasquale's presentation or not. Yeah.
The raw data is much noisier than you usually get with modern astrophotography cameras, because the Hubble cameras are very old and very irradiated. So their data is actually much uglier than our data.
and when you download the data, basically you're getting a pre-processed image. Even if it's not stretched completely, they have done all the processing, correction, background, calibration, which of course is a good thing. The raw data is probably pretty raw. So another question is, let's see. More data exposures reduces banding. Is that in all cases? Is there a difference between horizontal and vertical banding?
Horizontal and vertical banding.
I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding here between the changes in luminosity, like the changes in the color gradations, the luminosity gradations, and banding from a camera's fixed pattern noise.
Well, if you think of an image that you're referring, when you go from light to dark, wherever that largest stretch is, or the shortest stretch, and you have the shortest number of pixels, that's where it'll be most notable. For example, the sky was very bright to very dark. And you know, because there are more steps than there are bands or levels to cover them. Whatever direction that is greatest is, I think, where you're likely to see the banding.
So Ray has another question. What about dithering? That multiple subframe slide, does it take into account dithering?
Yeah, I didn't add any of that to it. Dithering, I would definitely do it, because that will, especially when you stack, that will get rid of a heck of a lot of noise right off the bat that you would otherwise have.
And Tim says, is that histogram cheat sheet available for download?
I can try to see. I'll have to check and see if the person that I got that from allows me to. If not, I will. I can make it. If so, I can make that available.
Actually, if you post it, if you send it to us, we could put it up with your presentation and make it available, if it is available.
Okay, I'll check on that.
And one more question, this gamma encoding, I'm trying to put that in perspective. Is that only for DSLR cameras that we do gamma? And when we select some kind of gamma value on a histogram, does that gamma encoding? I'm not sure I've grasped all that.
That's a good question. Cameras that are used to designed to shoot everyday people, everyday life, you know, like DSLRs, they're going to gamma encode them because it's important for what you're imaging to look like, what you see with your eyes. That's not important for an Astro camera, so I'm guessing a one-shot Astro camera probably won't gamma encode it. Don't quote me on that, but I would be surprised if they did. Because you're not imaging people, you're trying to image the night sky, and that just makes it more complicated for people. So if you have an Astro camera, I would need to confirm that, but I would be surprised if that was gamma encoded.
So if we have a DSLR which has been modified for astrophotography, is that a setting that we should look at, whether it is or is not gamma encoded?
Well, the fact that you modified it just changes the wavelengths of lights that are being captured. It's the software that's built in the camera is going to do the encoding for you automatically, and I can't see where changing that filter is going to change that. So
that's probably done with the white balance settings, I'm guessing. Changing that gamma value.
Yeah. Well, one thing you can do is if you do a lot, some cameras will allow you to go in and change the levels of each, of the colors that you're getting in there. So there may be a way of going in and programming the camera so you wouldn't have to worry about that. But I haven't tried anything like that. I've only done this because of my granddaughter uses the DSLR.
Okay. Did I miss any questions, Alex? Molly?
Any questions, but there was a very important comment from, who was it, Katrina? Hi, Uncle Brian. Yeah.
Oh, Katrina.
Oh, great.
All kind. Thank you. All the way from California. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Any tips in balancing the histograms with luminance data and an RGB set?
Could you say that again?
Oh yeah. Is there any tips that you could give in balancing luminance data with an RGB set without having the luminance dominate the RGB data?
I guess I'm not quite sure what you're asking. You're talking about balancing the RGB data?
When you do a luminance and RGB
Oh, luminance.
combination, yeah. Any tips in using the histogram to balance the two so one doesn't dominate the other?
I don't know if your camera allows you to balance it in the final capture. That would be part of programming it. I would think some cameras may do that. I have not tried anything like that.
Actually, I think we're talking about, you make up an RGB color version of the shot, and then you're going to make up a luminance monochrome.
Right.
And now you've got to combine that luminance with that RGB,
In
which
post-process.
isn't a DSLR type of question. It isn't a one-shot color type of question, generally speaking.
Remember for a DSLR, the luminance is an RGB that is combined. And they just combine it in those separate ratios. So you don't have a separate black and white, type of pixel.
He's using a monochrome camera is the point.
Bryan, do you do LRGB imaging?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay.
Most of the times narrowband, but sometimes that.
Okay. So I guess Terry's question, Terry, do I have this right? Is there something we should look at in the histogram of the luminance channel compared to the histogram of the RGB channel? Should we try to make them look like the same kind of slope? Should we try to make them look different? What should we do? Is that the question, Terry?
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
yes, it is.
Here's what I would recommend is you're going to do your RGB separate and do your luminance separate. I mean, those are two different processing techniques, and they're going to look very different. And most people are kind of happy to oversaturate the RGB because when they bring it in with the luminance, it's so much brighter that you're going to lose most of the effects of the RGB. But the luminance will bring in a lot of detail that you won't have otherwise. So you want a combination of both. So you might even have to oversaturate, for our nebulas in outer space, oversaturate, mixing it with some white isn't going to look like the rose that I showed you on the picture. It's going to look, how far you go depends on what you want it, but the key would be to put them in separate, and at the end, you blend them.
Okay.
Well, in any case, the way you stretch a luminance stack is probably a lot different than the way you stretch an RGB. The RGB, you try to bring out the color. The luminance, you try to get the best dynamic range of the histogram. And then putting them together always is another adventure.
Right, yeah, and you've got all kinds of leeway for us with the RGB, because you're not going to see really very much detail. The detail is going to come mostly from the luminance. So there's a tendency for all of us to, on purpose, oversaturate it so it becomes visible and pleasant and recognizable. If you were to actually be out there in outer space, it wouldn't look like any of our photos.
Well, as a friend of mine recently deceased, unfortunately, said if you stood next to any of these objects in space, you wouldn't see anything.
Right, yeah, right. The atoms, the molecules are so far apart, even in a dense thing, you might have 100, molecules or atoms within a square centimeter, or compared to what we have for our sky, which we can even see through. That's like 25 billion molecules. So it's like a vacuum, only because we're so far away, and with our eyes, it would probably look more, pea green is probably the best we could get out of it, unless we amplify it. Even if we're right in it, we probably wouldn't even see it.
Okay. It's getting a little late here. Getting a little late, so we're going to have to cut some stuff off here. Okay. Next week, John's going to be here, and he's going to be telling us about some changes in the nature of CMOS imaging that are just going to change the way we image some stuff and how we can best take advantage of that kind of thing. So we hope you all come back next week and see us. I want to thank Bryan for for putting on a real good show. A lot of information, and I think the people liked it. We kept our audience through the whole thing, so that was pretty good. So see you guys next week before we take the big 2-week vacation. Okay. Good night, everybody. Terry's been doing the work tonight. Did you notice Terry was zooming in on certain parts so you could see it better than usual? So thank you, Terry, for that. Anyway, it's about time for us to go. So Terry, take us out.